You don't really get taught how relationships are supposed to feel. You just kind of figure it out as you go. And most people figure it out while they're already in it, while they're already attached, while they're already overthinking, while they're already emotionally invested in somebody they don't even fully understand yet. And that's where it starts to get messy, because nobody really sits you down and explains any of it properly. You just get random advice, like be yourself, but also improve, don't chase people, but also show effort, play it cool, but not too cool, care, but not too much. And somehow all of this is supposed to work at the same time. It doesn't really make sense when you actually stop and think about it, but people try to follow it anyways. And then they wonder why everything feels so confusing. I think most people don't actually fail in relationships because they're doing everything wrong. They fail because they're doing everything while thinking too much about it. Every message becomes something to analyze. Every delay becomes something to question. Every small change in tone becomes something to overthink. And suddenly you're not just talking to someone anymore. You're monitoring them. And you're monitoring yourself at the same time, trying to figure out what you should say, how you should act, wherever what you said sounded weird, wherever you're being too much or not enough. And that constant back and forth slowly drains the natural part out of everything, because nothing feels natural when you're constantly thinking about how it looks from the outside. And I think that's one of the first things I had to understand. That relationships don't usually break because of one big moment. They usually get complicated because of 100 small moments that nobody talks about. Small misunderstandings, small assumptions, small changes in energy that no one really explains properly. And instead of asking directly, people start guessing. And guessing is where things go wrong. Because you're not reacting to reality anymore. You're reacting to your interpretation of reality. And your interpretation is usually shaped by fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of not being enough. Fear of the other person slowly losing interest without saying it out loud. And that's when fear becomes a part of how you see someone. Everything they do starts to feel different, even if they haven't changed at all. I think my goal, it used to be to understand people better. Like, I could just figure out what people really meant. I'd stop overthinking, I'd stop worrying, I'd stop caring so much. But it turns out that wasn't the problem. Because you can understand people perfectly and still overthink everything they do. Because overthinking isn't really about them. It's about you. It's about what you believe and how yourself is around them. Because if you genuinely believe you're enough, you don't spend every second trying to decode whether they still like you. You just exist in it. But if you don't believe that, then everything feels like a test you're trying not to fail. And I think that's where a lot of relationships quietly start to shift. Not because someone stops caring, but because one person starts caring in a way that becomes pressure. And pressure changes how things feel, even if nobody says it out loud, even if everything still looks normal on the surface. There's an invisible weight that starts building up. And most people don't even notice it's happening until it's already there. And the weird part is, the more you try to fix that feeling, the worse it can get. Because you start adjusting your behavior, trying to say the perfect thing, trying to avoid saying the wrong thing, trying to be interested enough to keep their attention, trying not to lose them without even knowing if you're actually losing them. And eventually you're not really being yourself anymore. The version of yourself that was designed to avoid rejection, and that version never relaxed. It's always thinking, it's always checking, it's always analyzing, always trying to stay one step ahead of something that hasn't even happened yet. I think one of the most confusing things people experience is when anxiety starts to feel like connection. Because at a certain point you stop being able to tell the difference. You think about them a lot, you check your phone a lot, you wait for replies, you overthink replies, you replay conversations. And because they're constantly in your mind, you assume that has to mean something. You assume that must be love, or attachment, or something real. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just uncertainty. Because uncertainty keeps your brain active. It keeps you thinking, it keeps you checking. It keeps you emotionally engaged even when nothing is actually happening. And that's the part people didn't notice. They don't notice that feeling of, I can't stop thinking about them, isn't always romantic. Sometimes it's just your mind trying to find stability in something that keeps shifting. And I think that's where overthinking and attachment starts to overlap. Because when somebody is consistent, you don't really think about them like that. You don't sit there analysing everything. You don't need consistent reassurance from your own thoughts. But when someone is inconsistent, your brain starts working overtime, trying to fill in the gaps, trying to predict what they mean, trying to figure out where you stand without actually being told. And the more unclear it is, the more your mind tries to solve it. But the problem is you can't solve people like a puzzle. There isn't always a clear answer. There isn't always a hidden meaning behind everything. Sometimes someone is just busy. Sometimes someone is just tired. Sometimes someone is just not as invested as you are. And all three of those can feel the same from the outside. So your brain starts guessing. And guessing slowly turns into believing. And believing slowly turns into emotional attachment built on uncertainty instead of clarity. I used to think if I understood someone well enough, I could predict how they act. Like if I paid enough attention to small details, I could stay ahead of everything. I could avoid getting hurt. I could avoid getting surprised. But all it really did was make me more anxious. Because now I wasn't just reacting to what they did, I was reacting to what I thought they might do next. And that's exhausting. Because you're never in the moment anymore. You're always slightly ahead of it, trying to prepare for outcomes that haven't even happened. And the hardest part is, it feels like caring. It feels like you care a lot. It feels like this person means something important. But sometimes what you're actually feeling isn't love or stability. It's emotional instability. It's your mind not knowing where it stands, and mistakes that discomfort for disconnection, because calm doesn't feel exciting, and uncertainty feels intense. So your brain naturally leans towards the intense thing, even if it's not good for you. And I think that's why a lot of people end up stuck in situations they can't fully explain to themselves. Because from the outside, it doesn't look that serious. But internally, it feels like everything. One message can change your whole mood. One reply can decide your whole day. One small interaction can feel like progress or rejection. And that emotional dependence builds quietly. Not all at once, just slowly enough that you don't notice it forming. And then there's this moment that hits later on, when you realize you're not actually enjoying it anymore. You're just invested in it. There's a difference between those two things. Enjoying something feels calm. Investing in something feels anxious. One gives you space, other keeps you waiting. And I think a lot of people don't realize they've crossed that line until they're already deep into it. Because once you start needing clarity from someone who doesn't give it, you start losing clarity in yourself too. You stop knowing what's real. You stop knowing you're assuming. You stop trusting your own interpretation of things. And that's when everything starts to feel unstable. Not just the relationship, but you. I think one of the quietest things that happens in relationships is that people start changing without realizing it. Not in a dramatic way, not overnight, just slowly, almost unnoticeably. At first it feels like effort. You're just trying to be a bit more interesting, a bit more calm, a bit more careful with what you say, a bit more aware of how you come across. And that seems normal, that seems like caring, but over time it starts to shift. Because you're not trying to be better anymore, you're trying not to be wrong. And you can't build a relationship of someone who isn't yourself. And I think that's where you stop fully being yourself. You start editing your personality in real time. You think before you speak more than you speak naturally. You hold back things you would normally say. You change how you react, depending on who you're talking to. Not because someone told you to, but because you're trying to avoid losing them, even if nobody has said anything about leaving. And the strange part is, the other person might not even notice, because from their side, everything looks normal. You're still talking, still replying, still showing up, still laughing, still being you. But internally, something is different. There's more tension, more thought, more pressure in small moments that used to feel easy. And I think that's how people slowly drift without realizing it. Not because one big argument, not because of one clear mistake, but because one person starts over-adapting and the other person just keeps being themselves. And the imbalance, that's hard to explain, because nothing looks broken, but something feels off. And when you feel that shift, you usually don't talk about it. You try to fix it silently, you try to be more present, more interesting, more understanding, more patient, just more everything. Thinking that if you can just adjust enough, things will go back to how they felt at the start. But that's the part people don't say out loud. You can't force the beginning of something again. You can't recreate the first version of connection by trying harder, because the beginning wasn't effort. It was natural, it was unknown, it was unfiltered. And I think that's why people get stuck, because they remember how it felt at the start, and they assume that feeling is something they can't return to if they just do the right things. But in reality, that version of connection doesn't come from control. It comes from uncertainty and simplicity at the same time. And one too many things enters it, it changes shape. There's also something that happens around this stage. You start becoming aware of how replaceable you think you are, even if nobody has said anything, even if nothing has actually happened. You just start comparing yourself to other people in their life, to people they follow, to people they talk to people in their class, to people you assume are better than you in some way. Funnier, more confident, more interesting, more attractive. And even if none of that's confirmed, your mind treats it like it is. And that changes how you act, because now you're not just trying to be yourself in the relationship. You're trying to compete with an idea in your head, an idea of someone who might replace you. And that pressure starts leaking into everything you do. How you text, how you joke, how often you reach out, how much you say, how much you hold back. And I think this is where a lot of people actually start losing themselves, because instead of asking, do I feel comfortable here? They start asking, am I enough to stay here? And those two questions lead to completely different behaviors. One builds connection, other builds anxiety. And I remember thinking at one point, if I just acted right enough, I could make everything stable. Like relationships were something you could maintain through constant effort. But the truth is, if something only stays together because you're consistently adjusting yourself, then you're not really being accepted. You're being managed, even if nobody means it in that way. I think a lot of relationship problems don't actually start with the other person. They start with how you see yourself. And that's the part most people don't notice. Because you can be in something with someone who genuinely cares about you, but still feel like you're not enough. Not because they said it, not because they did anything wrong, but because that feeling was already there before them. And when you already feel replaceable, you start interpreting everything through that lens. A slower reply doesn't feel like a normal part of life. It feels like distance. A change in tone doesn't feel neutral. It feels like disinterest. A busy day doesn't feel like reality. It feels like priority is shifting. And none of this is necessarily true, but it feels true in the moment. And that's what makes it powerful. I think people underestimate how much insecurity shapes perception, because two people can go through the exact same situation and experience it completely different. One person sees normal behavior, the other person sees signs of losing someone. Not because reality is different, but because interpretation is different. And if you already believe you're replaceable, your brain will constantly look for evidence that proves it. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it's trying to protect you. It's trying to prepare you for rejection before it happens. So when small things change, your mind doesn't wait. It jumps. It fills the gaps. It creates meaning where there might not be any. And I think that's where overthinking becomes something deeper. It stops being just thoughts. It starts becoming identity. You don't just think, what if they're losing interest? You start thinking, people probably lose interest in me. And that shift is dangerous, because now it's not about one situation anymore. It's about you as a person. And when that happens, you start trying to earn stability instead of experiencing it. You try to be more likable, more funny, more interesting, more easy to talk to, more everything. Thinking that if you can just be better, you won't be left. But relationships don't usually work like that, because the more you try to secure someone, the less secure you actually feel. And I think this is where people start getting stuck in cycles. They feel insecure, so they overthink. They overthink, so they can act differently. They act differently, so the connection feels different. And then the difference confirms the insecurity they had in the first place. It becomes self-reinforcing, even when nothing was wrong at the beginning. And I remember thinking at one point, if I could just understand what people wanted from me, I'd finally stop feeling like this. But the truth is, you can't perform your way into feeling secure, because even if somebody reassures you, the insecurity still sits underneath it, waiting for the next moment of doubt. And I think that's one of the hardest things to accept. That sometimes the feeling of not being enough doesn't come from your current situation. It comes from you, from past experiences, from comparisons, from things that shaped how you see yourself without realizing it. And until that's addressed, no relationship is going to fully fix it, because the problem keeps following you into new situations. And that doesn't mean something is wrong with you, it means you're carrying something internal to external situations. And it shows up in ways you don't always notice: overthinking, clinginess, distance, pulling away before you get too attached, or staying too close because you're scared of losing someone. And it all comes from the same place: fear of not being enough. I think one of the most confusing things about attachment is how easily it can be disguised as love. Because from the inside, it feels the same. You think about them a lot, you care about what they think, you want their attention, you want their presence, you want things to feel stable, and because all of that is there, your brain labels it as something meaningful. But not everything intense is love. Sometimes it's just attachment, sometimes it's just comfort. And I think the difference shows up in how you feel when they're not there, because love feels steady even in distance. But attachment feels like withdrawal, like something is missing, like your mood depends on their attention, like your thoughts revolve around wherever they're still there or not. And when that starts happening, it doesn't feel like choice anymore, it feels like dependence. And the tricky part is, attachment doesn't always feel bad at the start. It feels exciting, it feels important, it feels like someone finally matters that much. Like your mind finally has something consistent to focus on. But over time, that focus becomes dependency, and dependency becomes pressure, and pressure changes how you behave without you even realizing it. I think that's why people sometimes stay in situations that confuse them, not because they're happy, but because the emotional highs feel stronger than the uncertainty, because even confusion can feel better than nothing. Even inconsistency can feel better than absence, and that's a hard thing to admit, because it means sometimes you're not staying because it's good for you, you're staying because it feels hard to let go, and those are two very different situations. And I think another thing people don't notice is how attachment makes you ignore patterns. You focus on moments, not trends. One good message resets everything. One good conversation cancels out a week of uncertainty. And your brain starts living moment to moment instead of looking at the bigger picture. So you stay stuck in emotional spikes instead of seeing consistency or lack of. And I used to think that if somebody made me feel that strongly, it had to mean something real. But intensity doesn't always mean compatibility. Sometimes it just means instability. And instability feels powerful in the moment because it keeps you thinking, keeps you reacting, keeps you emotionally engaged, even if it's not actually healthy. And I think that's where people start confusing attention with connection. Because when somebody gives you attention, your brain registers it as importance. And when attention is inconsistent, your brain starts chasing it. Not because you need the person, but because your mind is trying to regain savability. And that's chasing changes everything. Because instead of being present in the relationship, you're now monitoring it, waiting, checking, analyzing, trying to figure out where you stand instead of just standing where secure. And I think that's where realization hits the hardest. Sometimes what feels like I really like them is actually I really don't like how uncertain this feels, but I don't want to lose it. And those are not the same things, but they feel similar when you're in it.